Hello and welcome to Kumza Africa Amplified. It is a pleasure to have you on this second episode of Kumza Africa Amplified, reverberating all across the continent and beyond. Today, I've got a special guest. My guest is an incredible leader. He is a former cabinet minister and former diplomat of the Mountain Kingdom of Lesotho. He has, of course, served in various leadership positions at multilateral institutions globally. Mr. Joshua Setipa is my guest today on Kumza Africa Amplified. We will be talking about his journey and, of course, his candidature for the Secretary General position of the Commonwealth Nations Association. He will be telling us all about it. You are quite busy, Mr. Setipa.
It's been a very hectic couple of months since I became a candidate, since I was endorsed as a candidate by the government of Lesotho and, of course, by the 16 member states of SADC. So, as you can imagine, the Commonwealth is 56 member states spread across all the continents, covering 2.5 billion people. So I've been busy reaching out, visiting as many capitals as I can. I still have a few left. The elections are in October, so still a bit of work to do. But it's been very interesting. I've been listening a lot. I've been engaging a lot with different stakeholders, and I will continue to do so until October.
How many countries have you visited so far?
Off the top of my head, I would say that I have been to around 35 countries in the last 6 months.
35 countries?
35 countries in the last 6 months or so. And over the next 2 months, I should be able to cover another 15 or so.
But when you visit all these countries, Mr. Setipa, what are they telling you when you present your vision for the Commonwealth Association? What kind of a message are you getting from these countries?
Well, as you can imagine, countries have different challenges. They face different challenges, but there's also a number of very common challenges that they all face, irrespective of their size. A very good example is climate change. We are seeing an increasing number of climate-induced disasters. We're seeing floods in Pakistan. We're seeing floods in India. We're seeing hurricanes in the Caribbean. We've just recently seen a Category 6 hurricane rip through the Caribbean, Grenada, Jamaica, with devastating impact. So the number one priority for most countries, in fact for all countries, is how do we deal with climate change? How do we minimize the impact of climate change? How do we mobilize resources to help us mitigate, rebuild, and build resilience also in our economies? So that is one primary. South Africa is not immune to climate change. We're seeing severe drought. We're seeing increasing number of cases of flooding in the region, in Mozambique, which traditionally the frequency of these disasters is also quite alarming. So that's where countries are focused. How can the Commonwealth, like other development partners, support their efforts to build resilience, to safeguard their communities, and basically to be better prepared? Of course, also there's a list of other challenges that countries are facing, particularly the small developing countries that are faced with increasing levels of sovereign debt. How can the Commonwealth and the other partners support countries manage this looming sovereign debt crisis? Countries are also faced with increasing cost of living challenge, where the cost of basic foodstuffs, the cost of basic commodities is increasing, putting many families at risk. Unemployment. Commonwealth is home to 1.5 billion people under the age of 30. How do you create opportunities for them to be able to sustain themselves? How do you create jobs? How do you create an ecosystem that allows innovation to thrive? Those are the things that governments are seized with. And then, of course, there's also the political issues. If you look at what is happening across the world today, in Africa, in West Africa, even in Southern Africa, we've seen cases of increasing incidents where democratically elected governments are being challenged or are being toppled or changed. We're seeing changes in governments that is done unconstitutionally. We've seen what has happened recently in West Africa, where in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, we've seen governments being removed by military, through military power. We've seen in the region here, we've seen in Mozambique, where a democratically elected government is being challenged by radical groups. Now, that, if not challenged, or if governments are not supported, if democratic institutions are not strengthened, poses a serious threat to democracy in the Commonwealth. We are seeing also what is happening in other parts of the world. We're seeing the crisis in the Middle East. That crisis already has an impact on the Commonwealth. The fact that trade routes are being threatened means that the cost of trade is also going up, which means which has an impact on cost of living for people across the Commonwealth. The crisis in Ukraine has had a significant impact on the cost of foodstuffs, cereal, wheat, because of the disruption to production chains and to supply chains as a result of that crisis. So that is just an illustration of the preoccupations of countries across the Commonwealth and the need to support countries to reinvest in strengthening democratic institutions, to help in build resilience in government systems, to ensure that governments continue to deliver to citizens. Because the unrest that we see is caused primarily also by a sense of disconnection between certain parts of society that normally expect government to provide services, but if they feel that government does not live up to its obligations, then you see the unrest that we see today in some parts of the Commonwealth, in some parts of the world.
What kind of impact from the Commonwealth is being felt by these countries as the Commonwealth tries to give them support?
The Commonwealth is an association of equal member states, 56 equal member states. It is an association that is built around a list of common principles. And those principles are what members subscribe to. To join the Commonwealth or to be part of the Commonwealth, you have to subscribe to those principles. You have to lead, you have to run your countries, you have to practice those principles, you have to be seen to be a champion of those principles. And those principles include respect for democracy, respect for human rights, respect for the right to choose. People have the right to choose who will lead them. Respect for religious differences. Communities, countries have an obligation to allow everyone in their communities to practice their religion without fear. They have to accept and be able to allow people to live their life without fear of persecution because of their sexual orientations, for example. So those are the principles and the values that hold the Commonwealth together. So when democratic institutions, for example, are challenged, when freedom of speech is challenged, when people are not allowed to associate as freely as the Constitution allows, that's a violation of those principles. And therefore the Commonwealth collectively has a responsibility to work with that member state or those member states that are seen to be diverting or moving away from those values to get back on track.
When we see the removal of these governments in other parts of the continent, what other people are saying is that those coups are granted because people have been neglected for quite a long time. What kind of a role does Commonwealth play in such kind of a situation?
I will give you an example of a current case of Gabon.
Yes.
Gabon is a member of the Commonwealth. There was an unconstitutional change of government in Gabon last year, if I'm not mistaken. Last year. And the Commonwealth, the first step it did was to suspend Gabon as a member of the Commonwealth. But at the same time, work with the current administration in Gabon to prepare for a return to democracy. To work with them to ensure that within a very reasonable time frame, elections will be held, that all parts of society will be able to participate in those elections, and they will be held in a credible, transparent manner that will reflect the will and the wish of the people.
Yeah.
So the responsibility and the work of the Commonwealth is to support countries, to ensure that through that support we return back to democracy. Now, as to the reasons for those military takeovers, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. There are many reasons why the military takes over government. It could be the perception that the government in place has neglected the will of the people, as you say, or serious case of abuse of power. But we have to take one case at a time and look at its merit. And remember that at the end of the day, the obligation of the Commonwealth as a partner to that member state is to support a return to democracy, to support a return to respect for human rights.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that I understand that will be top of your agenda is the issue of the global financial architecture.
Yes.
You are advocating for a reform of the global financial architecture, which I think is going to be welcomed here on the continent, because the continent has been saying for many years to say that the international financial system, it doesn't cater for us fairly. We need balance. So what kind of reforms would you like to see happening at the global financial architecture?
The reform of the international financial architecture has been an issue for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Particularly developing countries have argued, and rightfully so, that the Bretton Woods structure that is in place today, that created the World Bank, that created the IFC, does not reflect the realities of today. In 1945, the world was far different from what it is today.
Yeah.
China was not an economic powerhouse. India was not an economic powerhouse. Africa was not an economic powerhouse. And therefore, to reflect the realities of today, there has to be a rebalancing of how the power and the influence within those institutions is structured. The same discussion, as you know, is also taking place even at the global governance level, at the UN. In fact, in a few weeks' time, the world will meet in New York at the Summit of the Future. And they will debate and agree on a plan of action on how to begin to reform the international system, to reform even the UN itself, to better reflect the realities of today. Now, going back to the international financial architecture, there is, for example, an initiative that was launched within the Commonwealth, led by Barbados, that has gained global support, which argues for a reform of for international financial architecture. It argues that, for example, there has to be more liquidity in the international financial system that will be made available and accessible for developing countries to be able to address climate change. The cost of adjustment, the cost of adaptation, the cost of mitigation is quite high, and hence why small developing countries are faced with this sovereign debt crisis. So the international financial architecture has to reflect those realities. It has to have inbuilt flexibilities that allow developing countries, particularly small island developing countries that are at the forefront of climate change, to be able to have access to concessional financing to allow them to rebuild. Look at, for example, what just happened a few weeks ago in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
If every year Grenada or one of its neighbors has to rebuild because the hurricanes destroy almost 90% of the infrastructure on the island, that government will always be in debt because they will rebuild, and next year there will be another hurricane.
Yeah.
It will wipe out everybody on the island, and next year and the following year another one. Government has to continuously borrow. That is not sustainable. So those are the realities that and then of course also even just the distribution of power, shareholding power within the international financial institutions has to reflect also the realities of today. When you take into account when you take the case of the UN, the Security Council in the UN reflects an era that is no longer the reality today. So that also, Africa in particular, but also the Commonwealth, India and others are saying this has to be adjusted to reflect the realities of today. Yes.
Do you agree with those, Mr. Setipa, who say that institutions such as the African Development Bank and, of course, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, these are the key pillars that can help in terms of propelling the continent to help win it from the problem of indebtedness that you are talking about? Do you agree with those sentiments?
Very much so. It is a well articulated fact that to drive economic growth, inclusive economic growth, and fully unlock the potential that Africa has, there are two key ingredients. In fact, I would say there are three key conditions. The first is peace and stability. There has to be peace. There has to be free. People should have the right to choose who to lead them. They have to have governments that reflect that collective reality. That's one. So peace and stability has to be in place. Secondly, Africa has to fully exploit its potential to trade. And the ACFTA, or the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is that initiative. It comes as a result of a collective acknowledgement that intra-Africa trade is barely around 20%. We have not even reached the 50% of the potential that trade can do to drive economic growth in Africa. When you look at other regions of the world, if you look at Southeast Asia, for example, Southeast Asia, their trading, Southeast Asian trade is around 60%. In the EU, it's even higher than that. So the ACFTA was launched to correct that. We have to remove all obstacles to intra-Africa trade. And I'll give you an example. The historical legacy of trade in Africa is that the infrastructure that African governments today, that they inherited from their colonial masters, was infrastructure that was designed with one thing in mind. How do you transport raw materials out of Africa to Europe? That is why you will find a railway line from an African country that goes to the port, but you will not find a railway line from that country to its neighbor. It was designed solely for that idea. So it was never designed to facilitate intra-Africa trade. Even our trade, even our logistics networks. Do you know that it is cheaper for me to fly from Johannesburg via Paris to go to Senegal than to fly from here to go to Senegal? So we cannot talk about increasing intra-Africa trade until we fix that. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is exactly designed to do that, to remove non-tariff barriers, to remove tariff barriers, to make it easy for African traders across the border, whether informal traders or not, to be able to trade, because that's how you're going to unlock this potential. Secondly, going to the case of the African Development Bank, none of all that will happen without liquidity. So the African Development Bank has a very important role to play to make available liquidity that will oil. Trade finance is the oil that keeps the machinery of trade moving. If you don't have trade finance, there is no trade. And that's where the African Development Bank comes. How do you make accessible to small traders, middle-sized entities, trade finance that will allow them to trade across borders? Then you can truly say you've set the stage for an increased level of intra-Africa trade that will fully unlock this potential and see trade amongst Africa and within Africa. And it's not just trade in raw commodities, it's trade in processed commodities. Why aren't we processing gold from Ghana, for example? Why aren't we processing it in South Africa? Why aren't we processing cocoa from Ghana here on the continent? Why aren't we processing cotton from Benin, from Burkina, here on the continent? Why are we exporting cotton unprocessed to China? Lesotho and South Africa produce 60% of the mohair globally, but it is processed in China.
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. So all those are key issues that to fully unlock this potential that we know exists, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was created for, and that is why all of us, and including partners like the Commonwealth, have an obligation to support Africa in this quest.
The problem is that the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is not happening fast enough.
It is happening. We've seen, for example, quite positive developments. But remember that we're changing a system that has been in place over 75 years. So it will not happen overnight. The other reality also is that we have to mobilize significant amounts of finance to put in place the infrastructure that will facilitate the implementation of the ACFTA. It will not happen magically. There has to be roads. There has to be connectivity.
Infrastructure.
There has to be railway lines. There has to be ports that will allow for that. There has to be payment systems. You have to remove all these bottlenecks that make it difficult for Africans to trade with each other. Recently, I read a story of Mr. Dangote from Nigeria, and he was complaining that an Englishman will fly from London and be able to go into all the 54 countries on this continent without a visa. But him, as an African investor, will have to go and collect 40 visas
to visit
the
countries
his own continent.
On the continent. So
until we address issues around movement around the continent, we cannot say that we're integrating the continent. The services industry is a very big part of the economy of any country, but also of the continent. 60%, on average, I would say 60% of the GDP of most countries on the continent is services. How can you deliver services if you cannot physically be able to go and deliver them because you don't have a visa? So the ACFTA and its full potential will not be realized until we start removing all these bottlenecks.
But when you look at the high cost of living that the continent is facing, as the candidate for the Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations, what do you think should be done, in your view, to arrest this persistent problem?
We have to first understand what the underlying causes of this frustration and this restlessness that we see manifesting itself in these demonstrations that are spreading across the continent. One is the deep sense of exclusion that youth in particular feel that their governments are not creating opportunities for them. Their governments have not lived up to their promises of creating ecosystems that allow innovation, that allow entrepreneurship to thrive. The Commonwealth as a partner has a very strong focus on youth development. So we work with governments to see how can we help governments better deliver services. So service delivery is very important. Basic services, access to universal health, democratic institutions that conduct themselves in transparent and credible way, access to facilities or infrastructure, utilities that allow innovation to thrive, support for arresting this crisis around cost of living. The cost of living crisis is fueled, as I mentioned, by a combination of factors, primarily by developments that are far beyond Africa, developments that are happening in other key markets, which has a spillover effect on Africa. But also remember that because of the institutional or the infrastructural limitations that currently impact Africa, we are not able to move staples or commodities across borders. I'll give you an example. Tomorrow, you find that there's a bumper harvest in Zambia, but there's drought in Uganda, and therefore Uganda has a food deficit. But to move that excess harvest from Zambia to Uganda and be able to address the food shortage in Uganda is almost a nightmare because of logistics. So Africa has to invest in that. We have to invest in making it possible to be able to move and trade with each other and make up for those shortages. And that will help build resilience against developments in other parts of the world that today are affecting the food that are affecting food prices in Africa. That's one. But also, when certain parts of society feel marginalized and excluded from central government, they manifest them. That frustration is manifested into some of these public expressions of anger, where governments are not able to deliver services that are expected by communities. Then you see this frustration. The Commonwealth works with member states to build capacity to deliver, institutional capacity for governments to deliver services, basic services, health, security, access to basic commodities, connectivity, water, sanitation. That's service delivery. And that's where partners like the Commonwealth come into play. One of the realities that we have to also face is that the world today is preoccupied with issues around artificial intelligence. Africa has to also begin to actively seek out artificial intelligence applications that will advance economic growth, that will create opportunities for their youth. Now, there are certain basic preconditions that have to be in place before you can say that you're going to drive a successful artificial intelligence strategy. You have to have data scientists. Governments have to build computing capacity. You have to have access to commodities like connectivity, so that we can begin to exploit that fully. I don't know today, if you ask me how many data scientists are in Africa.
Not too many.
My guess is that they are not even a tenth of what they should be. India is training 1 million data scientists a year. A year, 1 million data scientists a year. How many are we training in Africa? If you ask me in Lesotho how many do we have, if I was to bet, I would say we have less than 100. Which means we cannot talk about a national artificial intelligence strategy when you don't even have the basic preconditions. So we have to invest a lot of resources towards providing those digital skills, creating those opportunities for youth to be able to then go out into the market and create the solutions that we need. That's the obligation of government. But that's also where partners like the Commonwealth come into play. We can work with governments, we can work with the private sector to create those opportunities for those skills. Because without those skills, we cannot realistically talk about artificial intelligence being a key driver for our continental strategies.
But are you getting a sense that when those suggestions, these digital strategies are being laid out to the governments across the continent, are they amenable to those proposals?
They are, because in my previous role as the managing director of the UN Technology Bank based in Istanbul, I spent 4 years working with governments, helping them identify where the gaps are in their policy frameworks, where the gaps are that would help them create the ecosystems around innovation. So there is not a single government I've met that says we don't see a future for ourselves on digital economy. But how help us create that framework that will facilitate. We know the innovation capacity or potential that exists in Africa. I mean, if you go to Nairobi today, you'd be amazed at what people are doing on agriculture, on fintech, and all that. I was not long ago. I was in Lithuania, in Vilnius. And I was surprised that Lithuania has a specific visa program just for Nigerians on fintech, because they are positioning themselves to be the hub of fintech in Europe. And Nigeria is the hub for fintech across the continent. If you look at over the last 2 years, Nigeria is number one in terms of fintech, followed by Kenya. South Africa is a distant third. So if Lithuania can recognize that potential, why can't we do it as Africans?
What do you say to Africans who are watching this conversation and then they are like, there's no relevance. The Commonwealth is not relevant for Africa and in modern day geopolitical landscape. What do you say to that?
I would take them back to the last 60 years.
Yeah.
And remind them that it was the Commonwealth that fought against the unilateral declaration of independence in Zimbabwe that saw the end of what Ian Smith was doing. It was the Commonwealth. I will also remind them that it was the Commonwealth that led the process of dismantling apartheid in South Africa. The first meeting that led to an agreement to hold the democratic elections in South Africa was a meeting that was organized and called by the Commonwealth, Chief Emeka, who brought everybody around the table in South Africa, President Mandela, Mr. Mangosuthu, F.W. de Klerk, and all of them, around the table to say, let us prepare for a transition to democracy. It was a Commonwealth that was at the forefront of that. It was a Commonwealth that was at the forefront of the return to multi-party democracy across Africa. In 1990, when Chief Emeka became Secretary General, there were 10 military governments in Africa. At the end of that 10, there were none. So the Commonwealth has been at the forefront of liberation of Africa, has been at the forefront of bringing democracy, bringing respect for human rights, of bringing empowerment of Africans to be able to determine their future. It has been the Commonwealth. Today, when you look at the democratic process, for example, whenever there are elections across the continent, across the Commonwealth, not just in Africa, across the Commonwealth, it is the Commonwealth that oversees and plays an important part in ensuring that those elections are credible and they are reflection of the collective choice of the majority. So the Commonwealth is still relevant as it was. Of course, the Commonwealth, like any other organization, the UN, the World Bank, always has to reposition itself to reflect the realities of today. The challenges that member states face today are different from the post-colonial period when newly independent African countries joined the Commonwealth and we're dealing with a specific set of challenges. We have to remember that at the end of the day, the one thing that the Commonwealth has as an advantage compared to other organizations like the UN is that we are not saddled with the north-south divide of the US, Russia, China. So decision-making and consensus building in the Commonwealth is much, much easier. Whether you are Nauru with 10,000 people or Lesotho with 2 million people, you sit across the table as an equal partner to India, to Canada, to the UK, to Australia, to New Zealand, and all these other big countries. And your voice is equal. If it has to come to a vote, one country. In the UN, if you are not a member of the Security Council, no matter whether you are strong on a position, but those that have the veto power can decide whether an issue goes forward or not. We don't have that. So the Commonwealth is an association of 56 diverse countries, but equal. So that diversity is also the strength. We're able to discuss and resolve issues that are difficult to resolve in the UN, in the G20, in the G7 and all that, because the Commonwealth does not have that historical baggage. The other reality also is that the Commonwealth, think of any member, any association globally, BRICS, G20, G7, in all of those, there's a Commonwealth member state. So we have representation in all platforms and all forums globally. We're able to contribute to those discussions. We're able to reflect the views, to reflect the values and the principles that hold the Commonwealth together. If the Commonwealth and its justification was in question today, you would expect that countries would be leaving the Commonwealth. In the last 6 months, I've met and spoken to every single High Commissioner in London that represents their country in the Commonwealth. I've met scores of heads of government in the Commonwealth. I've not met a single one of them who says we are no longer convinced about the utility of the Commonwealth. All of them still say the Commonwealth is very important to us. Of course, they will tell me that we would like the Commonwealth to focus its attention on this issue because that's an issue close to their heart. That's an issue that reflects their national interest. That's common. That's normal. if you look at the number of countries that are queuing to join the Commonwealth, that have expressed interest that are queuing to join the Commonwealth, that tells you that there's something that they see the Commonwealth as a value addition to their interests as member states. Lastly, an important issue is that, yes, the Commonwealth was created out of countries that have had one common historical legacy. They were all former colonies of the UK. Today, you've got countries that have never been part of the UK. You have countries that are not even English-speaking traditionally, that are in the Commonwealth. Rwanda, Togo, Gabon. They were never part of the they don't have that historical legacy, but they applied, and today they're full members. So that should tell you that, and it's growing. The Commonwealth is growing. It's 56 member states now.
Yeah.
And in the next 5-10 years, it will probably grow because of the increasing number of countries that are knocking on the door that want to be part of the Commonwealth. But I think if there's one takeaway, it should be that the Commonwealth, like every other organization, and I've mentioned the UN, I've mentioned the World Bank, I've mentioned the African Development Bank, even the AU itself, it has to continuously adjust, it has to continuously reposition itself to reflect the realities of today that countries are facing, because those realities change continuously.
You are the first Mosotho to be nominated for the Secretary General position for the Commonwealth of Nations Association. Why are you running for this position, Mr. Setipa?
I'm running because first let me say that I was endorsed by the Kingdom of Lesotho, and I'm very grateful for that. But I was also endorsed by the 16 member states of SADC. Out of the 54 African Union member states, 21 of them are members of the Commonwealth. SADC has 13 member states. Out of its 16 member states, 13 of them are Commonwealth member states, which means that SADC is the biggest bloc in the African, within the African group in the Commonwealth. Coming from Lesotho, I have seen from an early age in my career the role that the Commonwealth played in Lesotho. It supported Lesotho in its transition to multi-party democracy. It supported and continues to support Lesotho in institutional building, whether we're talking about debt management, whether we're talking about support to our judicial system. The Commonwealth is there and continues to support. So I've seen the Commonwealth work and to strengthen a country like Lesotho. So I believe in the values of the Commonwealth. I believe in what the Commonwealth stands for. But I also know that as someone from a small Commonwealth member state aspiring to lead the Secretariat of the Commonwealth, it sends also the right message that the Commonwealth is not only an association of big countries that only listens to big countries. Any member state, whether you're the smallest or you're the biggest, you can put yourself forward and say, we've got a candidate that we believe would serve this organization better, and that is what is happening. As you know, there are 3 candidates. I'm the 3rd candidate. The first candidate is the Foreign Minister of Ghana. The second candidate is the Foreign Minister of Gambia. It's Africa's turn based on the principle of regional rotation. The current SG is from the Caribbean, from Grenada, Dominica. The one before her was from India, and the one before him was from New Zealand, and the one before him was African from Nigeria, Chief Emeka, and the one before him was from the Caribbean, from Guyana, and the first one was from Canada. So based on that principle, it is now Africa's turn to put forward credible candidates. Now, what we are saying to our friends from West Africa is that if the principle of regional rotation is acceptable at the global level, at the continental level, it should also be acceptable. The first African was from West Africa, was from Nigeria. So if other regions of Africa, or Southern Africa, East Africa, have credible candidates, not just for the sake of regional rotation, but the candidates have to be credible. They should be given support, they should be given an opportunity. So one would expect that Ghana and Gambia would heed that, because after all, as Southern Africa, we support West Africa in all other forums. At the WTO, the DGs from Nigeria, we supported it. At the UN, the Deputy Secretary General is from Nigeria. We supported it. At the African Development Bank, the president is from Nigeria. We supported it. In the UN, we had a Ghanaian as Secretary General of the UN. We supported it. We supported him. And many others, I can go on examples of where Southern Africa has supported other regions in Africa, in particular West Africa. So our expectation is that they will heed this and will also withdraw and let Southern Africa provide the next Secretary General. Not because Southern Africa has never had a Secretary General, but because I am a strong candidate.
Sure.
I bring 30 years of experience in multilateral diplomacy. I have worked for the Commonwealth for a year as a senior director, so I understand the institution.
You know the institution.
I know the institution in and out.
Yeah.
I have been head of a UN agency. I have worked for the WTO. I understand global trade. I understand the global system. I understand how it works. I've worked for my government. I was a politician. I was a Minister of Trade and Industry. So I understand the regional dynamics also. I understand the realities of the Commonwealth, the realities of Africa. And I think on that basis, I am a credible candidate. And I should be able and I will be able to provide leadership that will see the organization strengthened, but that will see the organization become even a much stronger partner to its member states.
Do you think that the fact that West Africa has put up its own candidates, does that point to the deep-seated divisions that still exist here on the continent, in your view?
Well, I mean, the reality is that governments or countries have the sovereign right to nominate candidates, and it's an open competition. So I can't fault them for nominating candidates. I think that's within their right to do so. My only commitment, which I hope is shared by all the candidates, is that the next Secretary General has to be from Africa. First and foremost, the next Secretary General has to be from Africa. Now, as to whether the fact that there's three of us represents divisions, no, it represents, for me, it represents the potential that Africa has. We've got three excellent candidates. Each one of those two candidates can also be a very good Secretary General. I just think that I'm a stronger candidate than them. But I know that they could also be very good Secretaries General. It does not reflect division, it just reflects diversity. And diversity is good. Diversity is very good. It shows the continent has the talent. So our collective responsibility as three candidates is to make sure that the next Secretary General is from Africa. Yes.
I like
and
that.
Hopefully from Lesotho.
Hopefully from Lesotho, from Southern Africa, Mr. Setipa. I like that confidence. But if you don't get this position, Mr. Setipa, what would that mean for your journey? What would that mean?
At my age, I still have a number of years left in me as a public servant. So I will continue to serve. I will continue to serve, whether at the national level in Lesotho or even at the international multilateral level. So my story is not over yet. I'm just halfway. So I'm not that worried very much about what will happen to me afterwards. I'll continue to serve this continent in any other role, in any other platform possible. I'll continue to serve my country in any other role. I'll continue to serve SADC like I've done in the past. I'll continue to serve this region. So I know for a fact that I still have a lot to offer, and it shouldn't be a problem. And I personally, I don't want to think along the lines of will I lose? I will win because I am the strongest candidate.
I like that. I like that confidence. All right, as we wind up this conversation, I just want to find out, man, in terms of the lessons maybe that you have learned as a cabinet minister of Lesotho, any key lessons that you have learned through that experience?
I think if there's one key lesson that I have learned is that collectively we're very strong. So as a sub-region, as SADC, collectively we are an economic powerhouse. And for us to be able to be a player and influence global economic policy and make sure that we build resilience in our regional economy, we create opportunities for our citizens and we drive inclusive growth, we have to work together. We have to harmonize our policies. We have to ensure that when we talk about SADC as an investment destination, there's transparency and predictability across the region in our policy framework. So an investor does not come to South Africa and find a totally different set of conditions, and when he goes to Lesotho, he has to comply with another set of very different conditions. That makes us inefficient. It also makes us very unpredictable. So our strength lies in our numbers, and also, of course, I'm from a small country. I know that as Lesotho alone, we will not be able to make it. We will not be able to make the impact or have the impact that we currently have. But collectively, we can be able to do that. Whether you're talking about tourism, we should be able to have a tourist leave Japan, come to Southern Africa, and go across the region without having to change every time he crosses the border. He needs a different visa, because that's what makes us inefficient. Look at what Europe has achieved through the Schengen visa. They've achieved higher levels of integration. They've achieved higher levels of trade flows because the single market is working. Why isn't the single market working in this region? The oldest customs union in the world is here, SACU, 1910. It's the oldest customs union, long before even Europe had an idea about a customs union. Why isn't ours working much more efficiently than even the European customs union? So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but for someone from Lesotho, I've seen the value of being part of a collective. And the same can be said throughout the continent. The strength of Africa lies in its collective effort. So the ACFTA is our best bet to unlock that full potential for Africa to be able to become not just an economic house for the sake of economic statistics, but to be able to create opportunities for its citizens. Today, every day you watch TV, you hear and see stories about young men that are dying on their way to Europe in small boats. They're not running away from persecution. They're running away from hunger.
It's painful.
Why is it that we keep saying to ourselves, our future, the youth are our future, they are our future, but we're not creating an environment for them to be able to play that role? So they are going to Europe to drive economic growth, and we're losing human capital. The fourth industrial revolution is based on skills, on human capital. So how can Africa drive and succeed in the fourth industrial revolution when we're losing our human capital at this rate? So we have an obligation to create conditions that will ensure that nobody thinks about getting into a risky boat and risking their lives just to go and be a porter at a hotel in Europe. People with degrees, they're leaving the continent. We should be worried.
Gender equality, are you optimistic about the progress?
It's a reality, and it's long. There is no government or any society today that can thrive if it doesn't create equal opportunities to every single member of its society. Girls, boys, men, women have to have access to the same support. There shouldn't be any discrimination. So any government that does not support that is a government that will never be able to succeed. And the Commonwealth has a very, very strong, it's one of our values. There has to be gender equity. There has to be tolerance on religious lines. If we don't drive an inclusive society, we cannot expect the aspirations, or we cannot realize the aspirations that we have as a Commonwealth or as a continent or as a subcontinent. So gender equity is not, it shouldn't even be an issue. It's part and parcel of who we are, and it should have been so for many, many years.
When you look at Rwanda is making remarkable progress.
Rwanda has made remarkable progress because it legislated that. So maybe that's what all countries should, because it's not going to happen organically. It's not going to happen automatically. So maybe governments have to legislate. That when I've had the privilege over the last couple of months to observe elections in a number of countries. I led the Commonwealth Observer Mission in Zimbabwe. I led the Commonwealth Observer Mission in Nigeria. And the one thing that struck me was the disparity between candidates, women, female candidates, in a big economy like that, you'd expect that out of 87 million voters, that candidates would be almost, if not equal, but almost equal number of women and men that are running for election. You have maybe 16 presidential candidates and one woman. So we still have a long way to go. So maybe perhaps we have to legislate, because saying it is a principle that we subscribe to doesn't seem to be enough. The African Union has taken a very strong position on that, but governments are not doing it. They're not implementing that commitment. So we have to continuously make the case for it, because without it, we'll never reach our the aspirations we have in as far as development for this continent is concerned. There can never be development if there's discrimination along gender lines.
Mr. Joshua Setipa, it has been such a pleasure having you on Kumza Africa Amplified. I'm so honored to have you on this platform. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful experience.
And I'm wishing you good luck. I'm sure you've got it in the bag.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And that was Mr. Joshua Setipa there, who is vying for the position of the Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations Association. Those elections will be taking place in October, and we wish him well. Thank you so much for watching. It has been a pleasure having you here on the second episode of Kumza Africa Amplified, reverberating all across Africa and beyond. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.